Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Not at all. Thanks, Vicky. Well, I am based in America, but I was a UK trained speech therapist, and it was my absolute pleasure to work under Laura not long after I moved to the United States, a long time ago now. I just have the ultimate pleasure in welcoming Laura and you all to the 2021 Child Language Teaching and Therapy Summer Lecture. I think this is our largest gathering and most international, as Vicky said. Let me welcome Professor Laura Justice, speech language pathologist. She is professor in the School of Teaching and Learning at Ohio State University in the United States, and she is executive director of the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. The Crane Center is a nationally renowned research organization that brings together a multidisciplinary community of researchers, all with the shared interest of improving children's well-being in a wide variety of domains, including childhood education, health, well-being, language literacy, parenting, school readiness, and toxic stress and trauma. Her research interests center on children with developmental language and literacy vulnerabilities and the effects of teachers, parents, and as we'll hear today, peers on teaching and learning in school-age populations. Laura is a prolific writer and researcher with decades of federal and state funding to support her important research. And as Vicky has already said, it's really important to note that Professor Justice is a speech language pathologist and works in a school of education. So her area of interest and her approach really encompasses the core interests of child language teaching and therapy. And as you will discover, apart from all of the amazing official accolades, Professor Justice just happens to be one of the most dynamic and engaging scholars I have ever met. And she's an expert at clearly explaining complex research problems just as well as she is at finding solutions to them. So I'm so honored to introduce Laura, and her talk today will be on leveraging peers as active ingredients in language intervention, new frontiers for clinical practice via missed opportunities. Laura, welcome.
Awesome, thank you. Great intro, and I'm really, it's a pleasure to get to hang out with CLTT, the editorial board, and all the people who showed up today. I have a long history with the journal. I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. And frankly, it's a favorite of mine because of its relentless focus on real clinical issues, which I think we need research like this to shape our work with kids. Let me just make sure my slides are progressing. Did we move forward? Vicky, can you just nod? We're good? Okay. So I'm gonna share.
You know you're not on slideshow though.
Oh, okay, let me fix that. How's that?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna share with you a body of research that's been going on for about 12 years. This is one line of research I've been pursuing. I'm a little bit nervous about this talk because it's a hard area to study and to explain even, so bear with me. And I do want to acknowledge that I've had piles of collaborators who have helped me with this work, and in many ways are the people who have really helped me apply new methodologies to the study of peers. Just letting you know, I'm calling in from Ohio State University here in Columbus, Ohio. This is the center of my university. And we had a great year here. We were able to be open and welcome students on campus. We had a really rigorous test and trace program. And I'm also the proud mother of an OSU sophomore now. So she elected to go to school here. And so I love having her close. So you're all welcome to come visit anytime. And I also want to say that I love CLTT. And there's a real personal aspect to this, that I actually published my first paper in CLTT. And I'm not going to name names, but I was a brand new doc student, and I did my first really small study, and I sent it to a journal, and the editor of that journal, well, somebody's moaning. The editor wrote me back an email and rejected my paper and told me it was insignificant work. And I know exactly who that person is to this day. And that's just a terrible thing to say to a new PhD student. But I turned around and I submitted it to CLTT, and the editor, you know what that editor did? They didn't love the paper. Maybe it was not as significant as I thought, but they allowed me to turn it into a brief report and published it. And that helped me get my career started. And it also taught me the importance of brushing things off and being, sticking with your work to get it out there. So I will do anything CLTT asks of me, including being with you today. So in working on this talk, I decided that that was the stupidest title ever. Sarah wrote me and said, do you have a title? And I wrote this, New Frontiers for Clinical Practice via Missed Opportunities. I was like, what was that? So I'm gonna try to honor whatever that cringeworthy New Frontiers, Clinical Practice, Missed Opportunities. I think I stick with the intent of the title, but I wasn't really sure what I meant. So we'll see how it goes. But the new frontier part is the, what you see here, the focus of my work is on language intervention, which happens, it takes place in different types of settings. As Victoria so nicely indicated, our work takes place in clinics like a hospital or a special therapy center, but we also do a lot of our work in classrooms. And what I want to do is weave together 3 areas of work. And I'm going to walk you through each one of these. So one is what I call peer effects research, which I'll talk about. And then the emerging field of social network analysis, and then to think about how that can enhance the work we do with children with developmental language disorders. So the new frontier part is thinking about how do we weave together 3 distinct types of research or research foci: peer effects research, social network analysis in children with developmental language disorder, to inform the language intervention we provide. Most of the therapy that we provide involves other kids. And so, we can't always generalize to every setting where we provide intervention, because we have really mixed delivery models, but at least in the States, we have self-contained classrooms which serve all kids with disabilities. Some states only have self-contained classrooms. Not Ohio, where I work, we have what I would call push-in or inclusive models, where kids with disabilities are served inside the classroom. Sometimes the SLP pulls the children with disabilities out, and sometimes the SLP goes in. But in almost all of these approaches, there's other kids around, or what I'm going to call peers. And we have to ask, what potential is there with the peers that are sitting there with kids with developmental language disorders. We did a very large study. It's 10 years old now. It's a study called STEPS, Speech Therapy Experiences in Public Schools. And we had 83 SLPs document the therapy they provided to kids over an academic year. Very, very detailed logs of exactly what their therapy looked like. And this was actually a multi-state study. We were in a couple different states. And so we have detailed information about 10,800 therapy sessions provided to kids in the public schools. And you can see here, the prominent approach is that speech room. About 90% of sessions were what I would call like a pull-out approach. But then we also have representation of classroom settings, meaning the SLP is probably co-teaching or going into the classroom. But what's interesting about this is for those 10,800 sessions, only about 10% were one-on-one, an individual SLP with a child. So the vast majority of sessions, there's more than one kid there. So you have what we called small group sessions. I think that was 2 to 5 kids. We had large group, and then we actually had something called an extra large group, which was lots of kids. So SLPs, if we can generalize from STEPS, the typical SLP providing therapy to a child in the public schools has the target child alongside other kids. And when we dug into those sessions a little bit more deeply, of the nearly 9,000 that had peers, primarily it's another child with a disability who's sitting there, although sometimes there's typically developing peers as well. So I would argue that we're really ignoring the possibility for kids to serve as a mechanism for language growth to other kids. And as I walk you through this talk, I'm going to bring together a lot of different studies that help to point us in directions around how we can really harness peers as part of the therapeutic experience. So what I'm first going to talk about is, so here's one of the new frontiers, peer effects. There is actually a body of research called peer effects research. And this is work done by psychologists, but largely economists historically. And it's the question of, do peers matter? And peer effects research is designed to determine how much people are influenced by those around them. And we're interested in peer effects anytime you have a circumstance where people are together. So you can think about peer effects in terms of neighborhoods. You live in a certain neighborhood. Are you influenced by the people in your neighborhood? Your work environment. Dormitories are really interesting. Dormitories are interesting to study because at some colleges, kids are randomly assigned to dormitories, so you can do really good studies of peer effects. And then schools and classrooms. So anytime you sort of dump a bunch of people into a setting, we want to understand how these things influence, how the peers within a setting influence one another. A lot of the research on peers comes out of people who study social development. I do not have a degree in social development, and it's actually a vast field. People who study social development, they have, decades and volumes of research. And I always say things, and I get in trouble when I'm around my social development people. I'll say things like, oh, peer effects is about friends. And they say, no, peers are not friends. Friends are a certain type of peer. And so I just want to clarify that when we talk about peer effects, we're not necessarily talking about friends. Peers may or may not be friends. Peers may actually not interact often. So for instance, I run a very large center. There's more than 100 people. And in that, we have little networks that are created within an environment. And so when you're in an environment like the research center I direct, you have what we call social networks are created among groups of people. So Sarah Friel worked when I was at the University of Virginia. She was on you were on CHAT, right? A study called CHAT, I think. Yeah, so Sarah was on a study called CHAT. So she's in a university, in a center within the university, and on a project within the center. All of those are social networks, but probably that project is the one where you have the strongest peer network because that group is coming together at meetings and maybe social events. A couple characteristics of social networks is that they tend to be driven by reciprocity. This is really important when we think about kids in classrooms. So let's just say me and Sarah are in a kindergarten classroom, and I really want to hang out with Sarah, and I keep approaching Sarah and saying, do you want to be my friend, or do you want to play with this? She does not have to reciprocate. She can walk away. But if she reciprocates, that then is a process of network formation. Sarah and I actually then create a connection. Another aspect of peer social networks is a phenomenon called transitivity, which is the tendency to become friends of friends. So Sarah reciprocates, I become a peer friend or part of Sarah's peer network. I have a tendency to then become part of the network of the other kids Sarah plays with, and that creates a network. The third really important process is what's called homophily. And remember this, because when we get to the end of this talk, it's going to explain a lot of the phenomenon we're seeing. But homophily is the tendency to create a social network with people who are like you. And it may be the early in development, huge gender homophily. Girls create networks with girls, boys create networks with boys. We see homophily around race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And so we see kids, even by 3 years of age, gravitate towards kids who are like them. Think about that. Think about that the next time you're in a classroom and you look at the little networks that kids are creating and think about, how can I shake this up? Especially if you're interested in equity. And I'll talk more about that. Okay, so one of the things we have to be really aware of is that when kids are in classrooms, they interact a lot with their peers. So this is a graph, not a graph, it's a visual. We actually put GoPro cameras on little kids' heads and had them wear them for 2 weeks over an academic year. So they wore these, well, they didn't wear them all day because the batteries actually burned their foreheads. So we had to limit the wearing of the GoPros to about 2 hours. And if you want to know how we found that out, it's because we had adults test them before we put them on kids. But we actually had first-person videos of kids moving through their classroom for many hours over several weeks. And we really carefully documented every interaction a child had. And what you have in this visual is the A, B, C, D, E, F, G across the bottom is each kid. And so if you look, let's look at child D. This is the frequency with which they interacted with a child versus an adult. And so the blue is a child and the red is an adult. And that would be teachers, aides, and so on. So what you see is for child, if we look at child D, about 45% of that child's interactions were with other kids versus about 55% with teachers. You see a lot of variability here, but you know, for most of the kids, they're interacting quite a bit with their peers across the day. You do look at that little child A though, and what you see about child A is there's virtually no interaction with peers and they're completely interacting with teachers. And we really have to ask, why is that happening? And is that good for kids? And I'll talk more about why, at least when I think about language development, that child who's A is missing out on the rich linguistic interactions with peers, and it may in fact be harming the child's language development. Okay, so let's go back to that peer effects research base. We have to ask the question of, do peers actually matter? You know, I have 2 kids, Sarah, you have 3? Yeah. And if you're raising kids, you're probably paying a lot of attention to who their peers are. Who are they hanging out with? You know, do peers, what if they study hard? Does that help your child to study hard? What if your peers are gamers? I have a 14-year-old gamer, and I can tell you his only peers are gamers. And they do all sorts of crazy stuff I don't know about. But what about if peers are promiscuous? You know, what if you have a 17-year-old child and their friends are highly promiscuous? Is that going to affect your child? Drug use is a big one, tobacco use. What about drinking and driving? And so people who study the peer effects are interested in things like that. If my 19-year-old daughter has friends who drink and drive, does that then affect her behavior? So there is really good evidence that peers affect peers. I like this study. It's a little bit dated now by Hanashek, but this is a really good study of peer effects because it was an experimental design. And so this is a study of kids who were randomly assigned to dormitories at Dartmouth. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the papers on peer effects appear in economy journals, although in the last 10 years, we see a lot more in the psychology and education fields. But in this study 20 years ago, there was random assignment of kids to dormitories in their first year at Dartmouth. So they're coming into Dartmouth with no prior exposure to peers, and they are actually randomly assigned to dormitories. And they actually, they sorted kids into categories based on gender, smoking, music while studying, keeping late hours, and cleanliness. And then within those buckets, they use random assignment. And there was a very clear effect on GPA over that academic year. And so you see that upward trend, that's the relationship between a child's own GPA and that of their roommates. And so you see that clear linear trend. And because this is a random assignment study, we can feel confident that there is a peer effect phenomenon, at least that operates at colleges. And it's a reasonably large effect. Okay, so peer effects, we'll return to that. I wanted to introduce you to the idea of what peer effects research is trying to do. Now I want to turn to social network analysis. Totally different field, totally different approach. Social network analysis looks at the nature of the network in which you're embedded. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we have all these situations where people end up in networks, like Sarah was on the chat study. She's part of a peer social network for this study she was on. And when we look, people who do social network analysis look at how that social network itself affects children. This type of research, it's really, really difficult. And because Sarah, you're only one of 3 people I can actually see right now, so I keep looking at you. That's why I'm calling you out. But Sarah's on a study, so she's in the network. Maybe that study is a team of 6. So there's the network of the 6 people on the team, then the interactions between each person at that team, which we would call a dyad level effect. This is really hard stuff to measure. If there's any statisticians on the call, you'll know why, because once you start having these different levels of what we call nesting, your work gets really hard. But regardless, so when you do social network analysis, I put 2 examples here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Let's pretend these are each classrooms. And at the top, what you have is what's called a dense network, where you have lots and lots of connections between all the kids, say, in a classroom. And so that's what we call, that's a measure called density. How dense is that network? And when you're in a dense network, information flows really well because it's sort of flowing all around the network. Then you have what's called a really centered network. Sorry, that is not a good example. You have a less dense network on the bottom. Ignore that, a centered network. But what you have here is less dense. And in fact, you have if this is a classroom, you have 1 kid sitting at the middle of that social network who's really like controlling everything, and everything goes through that kid. This is actually what we might call a popular kid in the middle of that network. Everybody wants to be connected to that one popular kid. Goes back to what I said, peers are not friends, because people might be connected to this popular kid, but they might not like that popular kid, especially if that's a mean girl. Sorry, I'm alluding to the mean girl phenomenon, which my son talks about all the time. And so you get mean girls who are popular, it doesn't mean that's a friend network. I want to draw your attention to this little kid stuck out at the very end. This child is called an isolate. This child is isolated from the social network, okay? It's actually a form of bullying because it's victimization, it's social exclusion from a social network. And I want to talk about kids with DLDs and their vulnerability for that social exclusion, okay? So we'll get back to that later. But when we think about networks, we think about the social network as a whole in terms of how dense it is or how centralized things are. But then we also think about the individual child and their position within the network. Okay, so one of the things we've been doing for a while now is looking at the social networks of classrooms that serve kids with developmental language disorders. And in fact, this is a paper we published a couple years ago. This is 83 inclusive preschool classrooms. So this is the social network in each classroom. And so these are classrooms where you have kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities. And these are classrooms serving kids who are roughly 3 to 5. And you can eyeball this and start to see some things that stick out. By the way, squares are boys, circles are girls. Dark is a kid with a disability and light is a typical kid. Actually, yeah. And so like you can start seeing, if you just look at like squares, look at this classroom, you have 2 boys with disabilities. There's that homophily phenomenon. They have a tendency to create a network because they both have a disability and they're of the same gender. And you also see, this is a classroom that is not very dense. And these are kids who are sort of pushed to the peripheral of the classroom. So this is, again, just to zero in, these are 2 of those classrooms. And what you see is, I mean, one thing to notice is the classroom network is different. Okay, so this classroom looks like this classroom looks like this. How do kids create this network? Well, it's through those processes of homophily, transitivity, reciprocity. Couple things to point out. Again, these are 2 kids with disabilities, a girl and a boy. Look how they're pushed to the edge. And gray is actually other disability. So in these classrooms, let's say how many kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 kids in this classroom. These are relatively smaller classrooms. Usually it's about half kids with disabilities, half without. The majority of kids with disabilities have a language disorder, but some do not. Okay, so like you might have a child with cerebral palsy or a bunch of kids with ADHD. And so look at these are other types of disabilities. This is developmental language disorder. Let me clarify. I'm going to use the term DLD as an umbrella, meaning that these are kids who also might have other comorbidities, for lack of a better word. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So again, here you see the middle of this classroom social network. This is a girl with a disability that's not language. This is a fairly dense network, but again, look at these kids pushed to the edge of that social network. And we have to, what does that mean for them? And I would ask, what could the teacher be doing to possibly manipulate the social structure, or the therapists? And then here's a classroom. This is a boy pushed out of the social network. And again, that's a form of victimization. And it does not bear well on a child's future when you start seeing this social exclusion at age 3, 4, 5. I talk to my son about this all the time. He'll say, oh, everybody hates so-and-so. And I say to him, I'm like, well, what do you mean? Well, nobody wants to play with him. Always ask why. He's weird, or he this, or he this. You know, there's always a reason kids are being socially excluded. And I talk to my son about empathy, being kind. What can you do? I don't tend to be very successful because these these behaviors set in very early in classrooms by, again, these are little kids creating social networks where some kids are excluded. And some kids might exclude themselves. They might be shy. Kids who are shy have a tendency to exclude, but I would argue that we have to be really mindful of this. Okay, let's move over to kids with DLD. I don't need to talk to you about developmental language disorder, but you know, these are kids, oftentimes they have an unexplained leg and language growth. This is the most common reason a child is getting special education services in the US, especially in the young grades, age 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, before what we would call a learning disability becomes prevalent. When I talk about DLD, we're talking about a primary impairment of language, but it can be comorbid. And lots of people are not going to agree with me, but this is my talk and that's what I'm doing. So, and the reason we do that is because if you look at kids in classrooms, nobody cares. No teacher is saying, well, you better exclude that kid from being called DLD. The kid has a language problem and is getting served. And then the other thing we know is that kids who have DLD have lifelong adversities.
Aber ich weiß nicht, wie das hier weitergeht.
Okay, so I'm going to say something that is controversial and it really shouldn't. It shouldn't be. Therapy ought to be optimizing kids' language growth. We ought to be providing therapy in a manner and at a dosage that kids' language growth is optimized over a year. The reason I say that's controversial is because it means we ought to be setting benchmarks for growth and working to achieve those benchmarks. Okay, this is what we do in education. This is what we do in reading. This is what we do in math, but it tends to not be what we do in speech language therapy.
Laura, you've muted yourself.
Now,
Perfect. Yeah, great.
Okay, so when I say we ought to be setting benchmarks, it's actually crucial for the end of this talk because we have to set goals and then have strategies for achieving those goals. I understand this is controversial. We have actually made an effort to set benchmarks and say this is how much language growth we should be pursuing for a kid with developmental language disorder. This is a paper that came out a couple years ago. And what we did is we mined actually the normative details of a number of tests that were normed. You can read the paper, but we were able to say these are the benchmarks for language growth for kids across different ages. And so let's just look at age 5. Kids with DLD, their average language growth is half a standard deviation unit. That would be an increase of about 7.5 standard score points on, say, the self. You see the average kid who's neurotypical, that's the gray bar for age 5, they're gaining an average of about 0.7 standard deviation units over a year in language. I would say if you have a kid who's 5 that you're working with who has language lags or delays because of DLD, we ought to be saying, okay, over the next year, I'm going to provide you therapy that helps you meet benchmarks for development. And anything less than that is something we really ought to be querying. But anyway, it is, a lot of people don't like it when I talk this way. That's okay. But it is important for the work I'm going to share at the end of this talk, where we actually set the benchmark we want, and then we put tools in place to achieve that benchmark of, say, 0.5 standard deviation units for a 5-year-old child. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so now I'm going to bridge everything. I'm going to bring all these research paradigms together: peer effects research, social network analysis, intervention for kids with DLD to optimize their language growth. We're going to pull this together and see where it takes us. Okay, how you doing? Do you look like this? Some mom put this on Twitter. It's a real picture. Okay, a couple things I'm gonna do this really fast, but as we move towards pulling these together, I wanna make a couple points, and I'm gonna do it quickly. Number one, birth to 8 is the most robust period of language development. We have got to co-opt the plasticity of the brain and the rapid formation of synapses to create language pathways. This is it. The time is now to be as aggressive as possible in promoting language skills. Okay. Number two, for language to develop, you've got to have input, period. Everybody on this call knows this. Language is driven by input directed in these really important formative years of development. Everything we do as therapists ought to be targeted towards getting more linguistic input directed towards kids, period. Starting at age 3 across the majority of countries, these are the OECD estimates for 3 to 5-year-olds, the majority of kids in most companies are spending as much as 40 hours per week in classrooms. Okay, this is the percentage of kids in 3 to 5-year-old preschool classrooms across the OECD countries. And if you look, if you're dialing in today from Europe, your kids are spending a lot of time in early education classrooms from a very early age. Denmark has almost universal participation. What's happening in these classrooms when we think about peer effects, social network? Okay, the last point I want to make is that we put kids with disabilities in these classrooms as therapy, as intervention. By law in the United States, kids with disabilities have a right to be in classrooms with peers to create what we call the least restrictive environment. We are engineering this. We're putting kids in classrooms as a means to get them the linguistic input we want them to have to sort of flourish in this peak period of brain development. Okay, so just those are the 4 quick points I want to make before we go. And now I want to talk about how do we pull all this together. And so this is going to be the research we've been doing, considering what do peers and social networks mean for kids with developmental language disorders. Is everybody keeping up? Well, my dog is sound asleep.
Yeah, no, we're doing good.
Okay. All right. The first paper we did on peer effects back in 2009 is so I shared with you earlier that there's many other studies of peer effects. Does promiscuity between, friends you get it. What does it matter for language development? And so the first paper we did, we said, well, do peer effects exist? And in this particular study, we used a very large data set of pre-K. So these are 4 and 5-year-old kids. And we just asked, do peers matter to language development? With the idea, we're putting a little kid in a classroom and they're surrounded by other kids who are variable in their language ability. Does the language skills of kids' classmates seem to drive kids' language development over a year? And so that's the question we ask is, basically, are there peer effects in classrooms in the area of language? And it was a sample of 1,800 kids across 11 states. I'm not going to bore you with the details. I'm happy to send you the paper, but this is pretty simple stuff. You take a kid's language growth over an academic year and you ask, does the average level of language skill of classmates in these 450 classrooms, is that a driver of kids' language growth over the year? And it is. It's actually a pretty big driver. So what you have here is, this is predicted spring language skills with a range of 85 to 115. These are estimated. And what you see here is, put simply, the higher your peers' expressive language, the higher your spring language skills, okay? So, the way to interpret this is, if you're little Sarah and you're dropped in a classroom and the average level of language of your peers is, let's say the average is 110 standard score, you're going to have accelerated language growth over a year than if Sarah was dropped in a classroom where the average peer language score was, say, 95. Okay, so do peer effects matter? They seem to. Well, we wanted to know, well, what about kids with disabilities? What about kids with language issues? And so in this paper, we asked specifically about those classrooms that are serving kids with disabilities and typical peers. Do peers matter in this particular setting? So we said, does the language skill of a child's classmate influence the language growth for kids with language disorders in these inclusive settings? Okay. And in this is actually those 83 classrooms that you saw earlier, the social networks, which we mapped, and we had 670 kids, 56% have disabilities, and the majority of those have a developmental language disorder because it's the most prevalent reason a kid ends up in an early childhood special ed classroom. So again, we're just saying, how much of your language growth over a year is predicted by the average level of language skills of your classmates. And because a lot of you are interested in kids with because a lot of you are interested in kids with language disorders, for a lot of the kids, they just had language disorder, or people don't really, maybe speech disorder, but it's really a language disorder. And then we had a lot of kids with additional diagnoses like developmental delay, attention deficit disorder, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy. One thing, so when kids are getting special education services in the US, we know that they are because they have what's called an IEP, Individualized Education Plan. IEP is a proxy for a child has a disability that is allowing the school to serve the child. So I just wanted to put this up here for you. This is those 670 kids. This is the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, developmental pragmatic profile. This is a checklist of basically language pragmatics that teachers completed. And I just wanted you to see how different the kids with disabilities are from their peers on that checklist. So what you have here is kids with IEPs have a score of 68 compared to 85. That's a big difference. And I'm putting this up here to show to you that the kids with disabilities do largely have depressed language skills compared to their classmates. This is the peer effect in these classrooms. Let's look at IEP. These are kids who are receiving special education, and the majority of whom have depressed language skills. This is your spring language. And what you see here is if you have a kid with an IEP who has peers with high language skills, you actually look like a child without an IEP by the spring of the year, okay? I hope remember I told you it's complicated. Put it this way, if you are a kid with an IEP and you're in a classroom where your peers also have low language skills, you're losing ground over the academic year. And think about it. You know, if you're in a classroom with a lot of other kids who don't have very good language skills and that's your input, of course, your development is going to be effective. This just shows it to be the case. So we want to ask the question of, well, are kids actually directly transmitting language skills to each other? Because this peer effects just says your classmates matter to your language growth. But what's the mechanism? You know, we know look at these are our little kids wearing GoPros. We know they're interacting with the peers quite a bit. They're interacting with the teachers. What's the mechanism that explains the peer effects? And this is when we're going to start to think about the social network approach. So, oops, I spelled children wrong. So we really want to ask the question of, is this what's called a direct effect, where kids are directly affecting each other? Or is it an indirect effect that goes through the teacher? So this is, we've got 3 little kids talking in the fall of the year in a classroom. This is actually a true transcript from an old study where kids are bragging about how their dad shot a tiger. And it's like, nobody's dad shot a tiger, but the kids have this conversation. And you look at that kid C, and this child has really simple language in this follow the year, my daddy do it. The other kids are pretty sophisticated. And the direct effect here by the spring, this child C has much more sophisticated language skills. And you could say it's because the other kids are providing sophisticated language input. That would be a direct effect. But the other possibility is that it's actually driving through the teacher. So you have a classroom, again, you've got 2 of 3 kids have pretty sophisticated language. The teacher talks in a more sophisticated way, which then affects kids. This is what's called an indirect effect. We know that kids' language skills evokes an environment around them. So if kids have more sophisticated language skills, they evoke more complex talk from people around them. So this is legit. But as I like to say, this is knowable from a scientific perspective. And so we then sought to test, is this peer effect actually direct peer-to-peer transmission of language skills, or are they moving through the teacher? And so this paper came out not too long ago, and we're actually testing, is the teacher the mediator of this peer effect? This is the model. You probably don't care a whole lot about models, and it would be boring to talk about all these pieces, but this is basically kids' language in the spring. This is their classmates' language skills measured earlier in the year. This is teacher quality, or teacher, that teacher effect. And what you have is you do have this pathway, more elevated language skills in the fall. Teachers provide higher quality teaching, which does affect spring, but it's actually, this is the much stronger effect, is this fall language skill of classmates directly, it operates on a unique pathway to suggest kids' language skills, they actually are directly influencing each other, and it's not mediated through the teacher. So now, if you're following the path of the science, peer effects matter, and the peer effects seem to be operating through this direct pathway of kids are shaping each other's language skills. Well, now let's pull in the social network, because what we really ought to be asking is, are kids' language skills driven by the kids they're interacting with in a classroom? Is that then the mechanism? So as I mentioned earlier, kids create a network in their classroom, and every classroom is unique. It's driven by child network factors and to some extent what teachers are doing, okay, like certain grouping practices they might employ. So we wanted to know, are kids' language skills being driven by the language skills of the kids they interact with often? Okay. So basically so you can take this little child here, and we would expect, so this very bold line indicates these 2 kids interact often, and so do these, okay? These kids not so much. So we can ask, is this child's language growth over the year being driven by the language skills of this kid and this kid? That's what we want to know. And so we, as I mentioned, every classroom is unique. And kids are creating this network. So like, look at this classroom. Again, here's that kid who's isolated, who's only interacting with one other kid. What if that one other kid is nonverbal? What does that mean for that child's language development? So these are the questions we're trying to answer. Just for the curious, you might say, well, how in the world do you even measure these social networks? We do it 3 different ways. One way that we just published this paper last year. So one way is child report, which we actually use a lot. We sit down with little kids and we get a roster, and with little kids, we use the pictures and we say, show me the kids you play with a lot, and they point. And we also ask a lot of other questions like, show us the child who nobody wants to play with. Show me the child who gets picked on. So that's child report. This is very common. It's called a peer nomination test. We also use teacher report. We actually give teachers a grid and they say how often every child in the classroom interacts on a scale of 1 to 4. This one on the right is actually direct observation, where we sit and we watch and we code. And what we did recently is we actually took the social networks from 3 different ways. We put them on top of each other and found out that there were some differences, but the social network, there was a lot of validity to each approach. And I wanted to put this out there because this is doable in a school by teachers simply completing an interaction log for each child. It gives us very good details. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 papers we published recently where we looked specifically at, is it the social network that's driving development in these classrooms? And it explains this peer effect. So a couple findings, and by the way, this word play ties is basically how many close interaction partners a child has based on their peers' reports. So like if, again, Sarah on chat, we asked every child to tell us who they interact with a lot on chat. We know how many kids say they play a lot with Sarah. And so Sarah has like 3 close interaction partners. So in these classrooms, we basically predicted how many, let's just say playmates a child has. The number 1 predictor was if you have a disability. Number 2 is a child's language skills. And then number 3 is gender. Kids want to play with kids who are the same gender. Basically what you see is if you're in a classroom and a kid has a language disability, kid has a disability and kid has poor language skills, that is the biggest predictor of how many playmates they have in a classroom. This in-degree centrality is basically the number of peer nominations you have. It's called incoming ties. And I just wanted to put this up here. This is language ability and the correlation with how many incoming ties you have. And so this is that language effect. Kids who don't have good language skills have fewer playmates. Okay, they're correlated. I also want, this is that incoming play ties. So on average, kids have 2 playmates. Kids with DLD have significantly fewer playmates. And in fact, what I'm going to share with you is they have a really high likelihood of being an isolate, having no playmates. I think it was like 38% of kids who have DLD have no playmates in the classroom. And so kids with DLD, they have a smaller social network, they have fewer playmates than other kids, and they're much more likely to be an isolate, to be excluded from the social network. More than 1 in 3 little kids with DLDs are isolates. And it's 18% of kids who don't have a disability. This is bad. We don't like this. Again, it's a form of victimization, it's social exclusion, but it's also robbing our kids from the opportunity to get that linguistic input from their peers in the classroom that was engineered for them. So we want to act on this, okay? I did want to tell you, we have a questionnaire about kids' social pragmatics. And it's not that a child has DLD. The other kids don't know that. It's they have poor social pragmatics. That is the driver of this likelihood of other kids don't want to play with you. These are kids, they're not good initiating, they're not good taking turns, they're not good, you get it. But it's really a social language issue. Okay. So I know I don't have much time, but I just want to share with you that one of the question we've been asking is, if you take a kid and you look at the language skills of the kids they interact with often, is that the phenomenon we're talking about? And so we call this peer language resources. So Victoria's in a classroom, she plays often with 2 other kids they have language skills. Are those language skills driving Victoria's language growth over the years? So we're calling that's peer language resources. That's the language resources of other kids Victoria has access to. So we can actually, again, this is also knowable. What we can do is basically test the effects. Here's where we combine peer effects and social network. We say, is a child's language growth driven by the language skills of the kids they interact with often? Okay, and I won't talk about how we do this. By the way, this is peer language resources for kids with disabilities on the left compared to typical peers. Kids with disabilities have access to far less peer language resources than typical kids. Okay, and what we find is peer language resources is driving the language growth of kids with language issues. In other words, let's boil it down. You've got 3 kids in a classroom. Child A has a language disability. That child interacts with 2 other kids. They are also likely to have a disability due to the homophily effect. So they also have depressed language skills. Their language skills are the input to this kid with DLD, and it is actually exerting an effect on their language growth over the year. Okay, so I'm going to close by asking the question, can we manipulate peer language resources for kids with disabilities, DLD in particular? In other words, you're a therapist, you're working in a classroom, and you take child A who has DLD. Can you manipulate the classroom environment so that that child is going to interact with kids whose language skills are so robust, it's going to serve as an intervention agent for the child? This is what we're doing right now. So the task, we've been working on this for about a year. We have funding from the National Institute of Health. The question is, it's not easy, I should clarify. We have to identify the optimal grouping strategy in a classroom to say, okay, we want Victoria to interact with Mary and Martha because those 2 kids have the language skills that are going to really optimize child A's language growth. Then here's the really hard part. We need a continuous monitoring system to say, well, on this day, Victoria didn't really interact with Mary and Martha, get in there and do something. And then we have to examine effects on child language growth. This is not easy because it's the continuous monitoring part that's really difficult. But we have developed what's called a pipeline where we can actually have kids wear technology. This is what we're doing right now. So we call it a sensing system. We can actually put beacons in a classroom and kids wear a little tag and a recorder, and we can have ongoing real-time continuous data of who kids are talking to, how often, and who they are. And that can provide information to the teacher to try to manipulate who the child is interacting with. We have not tested this, but we have simulated it and been able to develop algorithms. This is way more than you want to know, but it actually, the algorithms say, these are the kids we want Victoria to be interacting with regularly to optimize her language growth over the year. And in our simulations, so this is on the right, you have a normal classroom. These are all the kids in it. And for kids with disabilities, which is the red kids, we actually have an optimizer that says we really want, let's say, kid 13 to be interacting more with kid 5. And I guess just kid 5. And so the teacher can get information to say, you really need to have Victoria interacting with Mary, and then can get information about the extent to which it's happening. If this is basically a control situation, if we can manipulate who kids are interacting with in this way, our simulated data shows that all the kids with language disabilities achieve those benchmarks of half a standard deviation unit over the academic year, solely by harnessing the peer social network, okay? So this is basically the work we're trying to do now. Is we have a study underway where we're in a classroom, we're picking one kid who has DLD who's most excluded from the social network. And then we're identifying two buddies who have really good language skills. And we're actually training the buddies to interact with that child with DLD every day during center time with prompts from the teacher. We call it the peer study. And so over the next 2 years, we're going to be looking at how this intervention can manipulate the social network and kids' peer partners to the extent that we can really amplify language development. So this is where we've gotten to. So I guess I'm just going to close by, these are the things that I'm thinking about. How can we really co-opt the peer effect in the social network to promote talk in classrooms? I think there are really big equity questions around how we engineer classroom settings for kids. In the US, we have a habit of, in lots of places, kids are tracked into classrooms basically by neighborhood. So you end up having a lot of, marginalized kids pushed into a classroom setting. The peer effects literature suggests that that might not be good for kids. And then ultimately, if you have your closed captioning on, you're getting a real-time continuous transcript of what I'm saying. What can those tools do for language therapy in the future? And so there's work now to try to take these technologies to get real-time continuous information about kids' experiences that we can then use to really amplify language learning opportunities. So I am going to thank you for bearing with me. And I pushed a lot into this, and I'm happy if you want to write me, I can send you the original papers if you're looking for some light reading. But thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Well, Laura, thank you. So it's Judy here. So I'm one of the co-editors of Child Language Teaching and Therapy. I just want to say many thanks for an absolutely fabulous talk, really interesting and really fascinating, and generating questions on the chat now. So thank you. I think we're all just giving you a silent round of applause, or a muted round of applause, however is the best way to describe it. So there's questions popping up in the chat, and I will do my very best to kind of bring those together. And I'll start off with a few based on what's in the chat, and then maybe we can go to some individuals as well. So I just want to acknowledge kind of the different contexts of speech and language therapy provision really across the globe that we have represented here. And in the UK, for example, we have slightly different or very different models to some of which you've described there. But I guess a couple of questions coming through are, there is really, from what you're saying, a real role for children without DLD or without difficulties around their language development to be involved in facilitating the language development of children who do have difficulties. So there's questions here really about kind of how we operationalize that. So I think it'd be nice to have your thoughts on what's the role of the speech and language therapist here. Kind of what's your views on inclusive practices? So is there a role for typically developing children to be integral to the interventions offered to children with the language difficulties? And I guess another question here, which may have quite a UK context, is there's quite a move to kind of communication friendly classrooms, the role of peer-to-peer talk. So it'd be useful to have your thoughts on those. So is that okay, Laura? I've just bombarded you with questions really, but really just your thoughts on that, and we'll pick it up as we go.
Well, this is more opinion than science, but I don't think the typical SLP who's providing therapy in a traditional school-based approach feels they're able to do a good job. And when I say, the evidence let's just say that the US model, you know, if the typical is, I see a child in a small group twice a week for 30 minutes, 12 of which is getting oriented and departing. I don't think there are many therapists who think they're making kids' language explode. So you know, the more I study what happens in classrooms, the more I'm convinced that's where the SLP belongs. As, you know, as a guide, as a person who understands language, you know, a typical teacher who goes through a teacher training program doesn't have a lot of training in language or language facilitation. So I really think that the SLP really needs to be more of an expert consultant manipulating what happens in classrooms than providing this. I mean, there's some kids who probably need that intensive one-on-one, but the average kid with DLD, I think, is going to benefit from really manipulating the environment. But
right, and there are a couple
opinion.
I was going to say, there's a couple of questions as well. So particularly, I know in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in the USA, I'm assuming it is, but we still have specialist provision. So what we might call special schools for children with speech language communication needs, developmental language disorders, where obviously there aren't the peers there that have the typical development. So that's kind of another context that people are working in. So kind of your views around that, particularly for that group with perhaps the greatest need.
Well, I have a strong dislike of tracking practices. And I'm sure there's lots of people who would say, you know, in these language units, kids get all these amazing things. And you know, I could be convinced if you took me there and it was amazing. But in general, you know, we have a habit of tracking kids who are alike into settings. So, and I just don't think, you know, we live in a diverse world and we need to, at an early age, have kids be around kids who are different than them in terms of advantage or disadvantage, race, ethnicity, disability, non-disability. And I think this requires very serious social engineering. You know, part of my job is to run a preschool, and we work really hard to blend funding streams to create a diverse environment. You know, the easy path is to not do that. Anyway, so I'm just not a fan of tracking in general.
Thanks, Laura, that's helpful. So I'm just going to go to the chat and pick up a couple of more specific questions in here. So there's one here from, I think it's Daniela. So she talks about the study that you've got in progress and whether children may not like being put in such a teacher buddy role. That's an interesting one, isn't it? So thinking of higher performing children paired with lower performing children and some of the complexities around that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the persons on our team does this work a lot with kids with autism. And so we're borrowing his ideas, and it's really, his work is focused on getting kids to play with kids with autism during recess. And so we're working with him who can guide us. And I will tell you that, I mean, that is a question we'll have to answer, but what we've been doing is, yeah, we'll have to see, because it's a good question. You know, again, think about that homophily effect. You know, and we're saying we want you to play with this kid with a disability, and you're right, maybe kids won't like it.
It's interesting, thank you. Another question from Stephen here. So parents, absolutely. So parents' views of peer interventions. I'm sure you've got lots going on, Laura, already. I don't know if you've got evidence around that, or sort of experiential evidence of kind of what parents would perceive around peer interventions.
The only thing, parents get concerned. So the earlier, it's related. Parents get concerned. Parents who have highly skilled kids get concerned when you put them in classrooms with less skilled kids. I mean, it's the ultimate parent argument against inclusion. I don't want my child in a classroom with this child who's going to do this. But the peer effects literature shows that kids with limited skills benefit from high achieving peers. There's no effect for high achieving. It just doesn't bear out that kids are being hurt. And there's a lot of people who have written about what is happening in the classrooms, that we don't sort of drag down the skills of more highly skilled kids. But that's the only thing I know really about the parent perspective.
That's interesting. And then just another question from Jan. Hello. So I wrote this down as well, actually. So we talk about inclusive classrooms and inclusive practices, and kind of expecting the typically developing peers to perhaps change their behaviours. I mean, is there a role for the child or the individual themselves with DLD to learn or to be taught strategies to initiate more interactions, to infiltrate into those social networks?
That's a great question. And I'm sure that absolutely, so sort of direct social skill training, absolutely.
Okay, so you would be advocating that sort of approach. Lovely. All right, so I'm getting fed up with the sound of my own voice, so I'm just going to open the floor up, actually, and if anybody wants a specific question to ask Laura, please do put it in the chat and we'll go to you. And Vicky's waving at me as well. Jump to do it like that.
No,
so I've just got a question.
I wasn't waving. I just wondered if you wanted to open it up like that, would people just let us know via using the hand? Because that's probably easy, because there are a few of us. There's myself, you and Tara. We can probably check.
That's fine. We'll try that. If anybody has got a hand up, I can't see everybody, so somebody's going to have to tell me. Theo. Great, Theo. Okay, so over to you, Theo.
Hi, just to follow on from the comments, I'm a speech and language therapist and I train speech and language therapists, but I'm also the parent of a young person with developmental language disorder and the parent of another young person who's high functioning and high achieving and academic. So I think what has been interesting, just in terms of observation, is that the child who is high functioning has a group of friends who coincidentally have siblings who have either autism or language disorder, and they have created, without any external influence, a support network for their siblings and a social network for their siblings, which is great to see, and it's great when they all get together. But I've been thinking quite a lot about how we can manufacture that within a school environment, and I think there's definitely quite a lot that we can do in terms of doing mixed social communication. So we talked about social communication training, but that also should be a mixed group of both the children with language disorder and the children who are high functioning. I think that's my personal view.
Great, thank you.
Laura, did you want to respond or?
No, I'm just glad she shared that authentic example.
Great. Thanks, Theo.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. Okay, any other questions for Laura? Okay.
If someone's hand is up and we might not be seeing it. I think Susan has got her hand up. Yeah, is that right? Susan, you're on mute.
I just wanted to flag one of the questions that was in the chat. So it's not my question, but David's question, saying, why do people object to the point about intervention benchmarks? So if he's not going to put his hand up, I want to ask the same question.
I don't know why. I mean, I think, first of all, and I'm not practicing today, so, I don't know what people would say today, but, back like in clinic, one of the things we were always told is we should not use standard test scores to measure change. So there was, that's not what these are for instance. And so, at the end of the day, I'm saying that we can take a fall and spring self, for example, or whatever your measure is, and we can actually hope to see changes in the standard score as a measure of therapy efficacy. That idea gets people really uneasy. What's interesting is this is first of all of our science is based on that. I mean, everything we do in science is we give kids standard tests and we look at change and we try to predict change. It's also what we do in the world of reading in schools. But I've just always found that people are not interested in applying that approach to language intervention.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Laura. And John Parrott's just put something here about trying to marry up intervention benchmarks with short-term limited dosage policies. So I think that may be quite specific to the context here, where a lot of children with these needs get a very limited amount of input. So trying to measure that with standardized assessments, I guess, would be particularly challenging in that context. Okay, thank you, John. Okay, any final calls for questions? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up and let Laura go on. Right, here we are, Pauline Frizzell.
Oh, sorry, just looking for my unmute button. It's not so much a question as a really practical and overly simplistic thing to say, but I was just thinking that even by arranging your classroom and seating children together, wouldn't that have quite a big impact on how peers relate? I know from my own kids that whoever you're sitting at the table with, you spend automatically quite a bit of time with them and you're exposed automatically to their language. So that was just my comment. I just thought as a really starting point, without having to use anything fancy, or that just by doing that, you could actually have quite a bit of impact.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we just submitted a paper where we actually asked teachers, pre-K, 1, 2, and 3 teachers, about do they use grouping strategies? And then what do you take into consideration across behavior, social, academics? And I mean, the things that we do, the vast majority of teachers are explicitly using grouping strategies in their classroom. And they are thinking about, obviously they're thinking about their grouping strategies. You know, you don't want to put 2 kids next to each other who beat the crap out of each other or whatever. So, you know, you're absolutely right that how can we harness the practices already happening, you know, for the social good. So great point, Pauline.
Thanks, Pauline. Sarah, you've got a hand up.
Actually, Pauline's point kind of fed directly into my query, which was because we are this interdisciplinary group of speech therapists and teachers, I'm just alert to the fact that my training and my background and my professional lens might not be thinking about grouping, but of course teachers, professionals, you know, going through professional training, presumably this is a large portion of the craft of the classroom and teaching and how to develop small groupings. So thinking back to that chat project, Laura, and thinking about how part of the training that we were doing for the teachers and all our efforts in thinking about teacher effects and language input from the teacher, a portion of that training was thinking about developing peer interactions. And so I'm just figuring that a lot of teachers already come with a phenomenal skill set that my training and background and lens wouldn't necessarily lend itself to this task.
Absolutely, Sarah, and I think Marie Pierce just validated your point in the chat as well, so that's great.
And can I say, Judy, what a great, I don't know if we are ending off, well, soon we will be, but what a great end to kind of just reaffirming the need for collaboration between teachers and speech and language therapists. And can I say that that's exactly what CLTT is all about?
Great. Okay, so my 14-year-old son is ringing me because in England there's a very important football match taking place today for our international colleagues. That is England and, get this right, Denmark. And I'm sure we've got colleagues joining us from Denmark. But I just want to, I think we all want to say a massive thank you to Laura for taking the time to talk to us about all the amazing work she's been doing and continues to do. Really appreciate it, Laura. And as you were talking, I did take 30 seconds just to look at your papers in CLTT, and I found 5 papers that you have authored during your long career, going back to 1998. Would that be right? That's what's on the system. Great. So fantastic contribution to child language and teaching and therapy. Lovely to see so many international colleagues with us today, and what a great forum to come together. So just a few final words from us here. Just say thank you very much. Do have a look at Child Language and Teaching in Therapy. Do consider submitting to the journal as well. And we look forward to communicating more through our journals. And we have a special issue coming out later on in the year, which is edited by Sarah Friel, which is on language and literacy too. So we're very much looking forward to that coming out.